Hello everyone. In this video I would like to look at Among School Children by William Butler Yeats. Now this is a very complex poem and I'll try to do it without my chalkboard and just try to talk. It would be good to have a copy of the poem in front of you. You can find it online free if you Google it, Among School Children by William Butler Yeats. Now, although the title of this poem does not include the word ode, it is very much an ode. An ode is a longer lyrical poem that takes us on a journey, sort of emotional, spiritual, intellectual journey, as the poet in his own voice is taking us on a journey through his own psyche. It's very much what the Romantics called a crisis poem, where our poet finds himself in a crisis where he's sort of cut off from himself or from God or from his own emotions, and he needs to work out that crisis through the poem to find a resolution. Now, Yeats is an amazing poet. I would actually compare him to Picasso simply in the sense that most great artists have a period when they do really, really well, and then they sort of peter out. That even happened to somebody like Wordsworth. But somehow Yeats, like Picasso, kept reinventing himself, writing great poetry in his 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, on into his 70s, which doesn't normally happen. Again, most artists have a great moment, maybe in early or middle age, and then they're a little bit less effective. But not Yeats. He found a way to keep reinventing himself. He even came up with his own sort of mythology at one point to write poems like The Second Coming and Leda and the Swan. This poem he wrote when he was 60, and yet it still has all the passion of a young man. But with that passion is a new kind of control. Now, odes, if you think of the Intimation Ode by William Wordsworth or Dejection and Ode by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, often odes use an irregular stanza. In other words, each stanza has a different length. The lines change, the rhyme scheme changes, because it's a way of keeping up with the flux and flow of the thought. But John Keats wrote two famous odes called Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn, where he chose to use a regular stanza. Probably because the emotion was so strong in the poem, he wanted to have some way to contain it in a formal way. And that's what Yeats does in this very, very emotional poem. But he chooses, oddly, a rhyme scheme called Ottava Rima. It's an 8-line stanza rhymed A-B, 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 C-C. Now, it was used most famously by Lord Byron for his mock epic Don Juan, but he himself got it from an Italian style that was used in old Italian romances. So it's a form that calls up romance. In some ways, the lost romance of the medieval romances, the kind of things that Don Quixote tries to bring back, but it's sort of too late. It's kind of silly by the time you get to the Renaissance. And what's amazing is that Yeats chooses to use this style of ottava rima. And it's important because this poem, its first stanza, actually begins in a very common, quotidian, seemingly mundane way. That first stanza is not going to prepare us for the incredible burst of passion and deep emotion that this poem is going to wrestle with. But I think that the ottava rima prepares us for it. Well, let's dive in. Okay, the first stanza, again, begins in a very simple, mundane way. The poet says, and the poet is Yeats, I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. A kind old nun in a white hood replies, the children learn to cipher and to sing, to study reading books and history, to cut and sew, be neat in everything in the best modern way. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. Now, we know that the I is Yeats here because when he was about 60, he was a poet and he'd made success, he'd made some money, but the Irish government loved him. Some of the Irish have always taken their poets very seriously and reached out and embraced them. And so to help him out, when he was older, they basically gave him a government job to go and look at schools and evaluate them and things. And it was a real job, and I think it was also a way to help the poet to get some money and get him involved in the state and in the country. And so this is very much Yeats himself going through a schoolroom. And again, it seems so matter of fact. The diction is very, very simple, very, very mundane. There's no preparation of what's going to happen in the next stanza, except for the anavarima that is used or was used for old medieval romances. Now, it's kind of interesting because as he walks through this school, which is obviously a Catholic school because there's a nun there, as he's walking through the school, he's questioning and answering with a nun wearing a hood. Well, that immediately calls up Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante and Virgil are going back and forth with question and answer about the nature of hell and purgatory. And in all the paintings and pictures of it, we always have a hood on Virgil. So it's clearly a direct reference to Dante, and it shows us that we're on a journey. Not literally through hell, purgatory, and paradise, but an internal journey through the poet and through his struggles. And again, he seems like this, as he calls himself, a 60-year-old smiling public man. And it's kind of weird because look at the end of that stanza again. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. Do you see what we're doing? Yeats is allowing us to look at the children looking at him. So right away, we've got this odd perspective, this odd way of searching the mind of this poet. But Yeats has found a way to make it a little bit objective, a way of stepping out of himself for a moment and letting the children look at him and allowing him to reevaluate himself from his childhood to his adulthood. And he's preparing to take us on a sort of sentimental journey. And again, the beginning, it seems like, oh, this is just some old codger walking around doing this job. And then look at the beginning of the second stanza. I dream of a Lydian body bent above a sinking fire. Whoa, where'd that come from? This is not just some smiling old public man. This is a man that has deep passions, that is filled with images that haunt him. Now, Lydia, or Leda, was the mother of Helen of Troy. And if you know the story, Zeus came to Leda in the form of a swan and seduced her. And after 9 months, she gave birth to an egg. And out of that egg cracked Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, but the woman who also started the Trojan War. And Yeats had written a famous sonnet called Leda and the Swan. So he was obsessed with this story. But he was more obsessed just mythologically. For most of his life, he was in love with a beautiful woman, considered the most beautiful woman in Ireland, a famous actress who had basically played Ireland in a bunch of plays, and her name was Maud Gonne. And Yeats always loved her, several times asked her to marry him, but she always turned him down. Yeats was kind of a goofy-looking little guy, even though he's a great poet. And Maud Gonne was this tall, stately woman. And Yeats not only loved her from afar as a woman he wanted to marry, he loved her because he considered her an embodiment of the spirit of Ireland. And Yeats was also a great famous playwright who wrote plays, again, that memorialize or allegorize Ireland and the spirit of Ireland that he loved. And throughout his life, the image of Maud Gonne haunted him. One of the last poems he wrote about Maud Gonne was called The Wild Swans of Cool. And it's a beautiful poem. It's a crisis poem, but there's really no resolution. He couldn't find resolution because Maud Gonne kept turning him down. But folks, if you want to be a great poet, the girl has to turn you down because that's the way you deal with your emotions and you seek resolution. Well, finally, shortly after writing The Wild Swans of Cool, he did actually marry a woman who did make him happy and he was able to move on. But always the image of Maud Gonne haunted him. And whenever you hear the image of Leda or Helen, he's talking about Maud Gonne, and it's his way of dealing with those. And again, he was happy with his wife by now, but he still needed to find a way to deal with that image, that lost romance, that lost love, the life that could have been. And part of what he does in Among School Children is to write a poem in which he deals with the images that haunt him. And not only the images that haunt Yeats, but the images that haunt all of us, the lost opportunities, the what might have been. And that's one of the things that gives this poem its power and its vitality, even though it's a difficult poem, as we'll see as I work our way through it. So again, I would never have expected the Lydian body reading the first stanza, except for the fact that the Adavarima was cluing me into the fact that there must be a romance aspect to that. All right, let's look at the second stanza. I dream of a Lydian body bent above a sinking fire, a tale that she told of a harsh reproof or trivial event that changed some childish day to tragedy, told, and it seemed that our two natures blent into a sphere from youthful sympathy, or else to alter Plato's parable into the yolk and white of the one shell. Now, what's going on here? It's a rather difficult stanza. This is a moment when Maud Gonne, the adult Maud Gonne, shared with the adult Yeats an incident that happened in her past. And you might remember this, especially if you're a girl, where you go to school, whatever, and somebody says something that teases you, and suddenly you feel exposed in front of everyone. And it's just a horrible moment for anybody, but a lot of times a little girl will remember that forever, right? And it will still haunt her, and she'll still, kind of be angry at the girl that exposed her and embarrassed her in front of her friends. But the fact that Maud Gonne has shared this moment with Yeats causes them for a moment to be bonded together, right? A lot of times, I think male friendships begin when we do something together. We go hunting or fighting. But a lot of times, I think a female friendship begins when the girls share with each other some terrible memory from childhood that hurt them so deeply, and it sort of binds them together. And in this case, when Maud Gonne shares that with Yeats, suddenly Yeats feels a connection to her, as if for a moment she is his soulmate, right? That was he never forgot that moment, because for a second they were joined together. And he uses the image of the yolk and white of an egg that is so intimately joined together. And of course, that egg is linked itself to Leda and the Swan, because Leda gave birth to the egg, and out of the egg was born Helen, Maud Gonne. But he mentions Plato. Well, in Plato's Symposium, it is a dialogue about love. And in that dialogue, Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, tells this scandalous story of why we fall in love with people and look for our soulmate. And he says that in the beginning, we were all two people combined with four arms and four legs, and we were sort of back to back, and we could spin, and we were super strong and all, and the gods were afraid of us, sort of a Tower of Babel story, and they split us in half and turned us around. And ever since, we are seeking our other half. This is where we get the idea of the soulmate. It's really not a Christian idea, folks. It's a Platonic idea that we're seeking our soulmate, our other half. And when we find our other half, Aristophanes says, all we want to do is hug that person and join back, if we could, into one person again. And again, that's part of the image that he always felt like Maud Gonne was his soulmate, but they could never be one. But in this moment that he still remembers from long ago, when she shared that, it gave them a kind of intimacy that joined them together. And once again, that image, both the image of Maud Gonne telling him the secret and the image of the young Maud Gonne that she had told him. I mean, he didn't know her when she was a little girl, but it's become so real for him. And then suddenly, after this reverie, he turns back to the schoolroom and he says, and thinking of that fit of grief or rage, I look upon one child or t'other there, and wonder if she should so at that age. For even daughters of the Swan can share something of every paddler's heritage, and have the colour upon cheek or hair. And thereupon my heart is driven wild. She stands before me as a living child. So suddenly, any of these children could be a young Maud Gonne. Now, unfortunately, we live in a sort of sick age with perversion and all. This is not the old Yeats lusting after one of the girls. Please, that's a modern sickness of our age. Suddenly, as he looks and thinks any of these girls could be the young Maud Gonne, it's if that image has come back into his mind and has been reborn, and he needs to wrestle with that image all over again. And then, As he looks at the girl, as he thinks of Maud Gonne, as he thinks of his memory of her, another image floats into his mind. Again, that's what this poem is about, how we deal with images that haunt us. And so in stanza 4, he says her present image, in other words, the adult Maud Gonne. Suddenly, so he thinks of the adult Maud Gonne, which makes him think of the child, which makes him think of the girls there, which comes back again. So back and forth. It's as if time is shifting in this ode. He says, Maud's present image floats into the mind. Did quattrocento finger fashion it, hollow of cheek as though it drank the wind, and took a mess of shadows for its meat. And I, though never of Lydian kind, had pretty plumage once. Enough of that. Better to smile on all that smile, and show there is a comfortable kind of old scarecrow. Now, quattrocento is Italian for the 1400s. We in English, we say the 15th century. The Italians say the 1400s. And that's really the beginning of the Renaissance, the 15th century or 1400s. And that's when, the Michelangelo, Leonardo, Botticelli, they're starting to draw those beautiful women that are so ethereal. Think of Botticelli's Birth of Venus or Primavera, which is actually the same lovely model in both of those. And suddenly she becomes, Maud Gonne, this ethereal image of art, this sort of icon that goes all the way back to the Renaissance, a sort of sense of beauty that has always floated in the air, that seems ethereal, that seems otherworldly, that you can't grasp. And suddenly he says, and I had pretty plumage once. I also had pretty plumage once, though it was a long time ago. The plumage moved down here, as you can see. But I love this moment because suddenly Yeats accepts it. At first you might think, oh, I'm 60 years old, it's too old. But no, he says, hey, I'm a scarecrow, right? Old man upon a stick. There's another poem he wrote called Samlington Byzantium where he compares himself to a tattered coat upon a stick because he was always very thin, Yeats. So this old thin guy, this scarecrow, but he accepts it. Okay, that's fine. And then suddenly in stanza 5, we shift again. This is a poem that is moving because it's dealing with such complexity. It's dealing with past, present, and future, with images, with all of these things. And suddenly he goes on a segue that reminds me of an old metaphysical poem by John Donne. John Donne would often come up with these surprising and arresting metaphors. We call them conceits, and we never know where he's going to go. Something very technical, psychological, theological, philosophical. And Yeats starts playing with us. And suddenly he says, what youthful mother, a shape upon her lap, honey of generation had betrayed, and that must sleep, shriek, struggle to escape as recollection or the drug decide, would think her son, did she but see that shape with 60 or more winters on its head, a compensation for the pang of its birth, or the uncertainty of his setting forth. Okay, that's really complicated, like a John Donne poem. All right, what he's talking about here is this old idea, and he links it to honey of generation, but we can also link it to Plato, of this idea that the soul drinks of some kind of potion that makes it forget its past life so that it can be born again. And we see this in the myth of that's the very end of Plato's Republic, where the souls, in this case, drink from the river Lethe and forget their past life, their pre-existence, so they can come into the world. This may also be Yeats's way of referencing the Intimations Ode by Wordsworth, because in that poem, Wordsworth suggests maybe our soul existed in heaven before it came to earth. And once we came to earth, one of the roles of nature was to make us forget our pre-existence in heaven. Because think about it, if we kept remembering that brief moment we were in heaven, we can never be part of this world. We would always be haunted by our prenatal or antenatal memories of heaven. And so it makes sense that he would not only bring up Wordsworth because he's writing an ode, a crisis poem, but because this is Yeats trying to deal with how can I let go of those images and enjoy my life now as it is. A lot of poetry wrestles with that. So again, it's kind of a strange, elusive way of saying it. But here is a child on the earth that's been dragged in and has been forced to forget the past and must deal with this new world with all of its pains and all of its twists and turns. But the main point of this stanza is, What mother, imagine a mother holding a little baby in her arms, and she looks at the baby, and there's so much love, and this image is so powerful. But imagine if she could look at the baby and suddenly see an old bald-headed guy. What would she do? Oh my God, what would she do if she suddenly saw him? That's what the baby will become someday. If she could see that image, would she think that it was a compensation for the pangs of his birth or the uncertainty of his setting forth? Would it be worth it? Would it be worth giving birth? And of course, a poet gives birth to a poem, sometimes through his own pain, right? Would she think it was worth it if suddenly that image, that cherished image of that sentimental image of that young innocent child, if suddenly she could see that child, a grown-up old man, maybe having lost his opportunities or what, would she think it was worth it? We live by these images. Then the poem shifts again, unexpectedly. And in stanza 6, we get what amounts to a history of Western philosophy, particularly Greek philosophy. And he's going to mention Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. He puts it out of order because really Pythagoras is first, then Plato, then Aristotle in terms of chronology and also in terms of influence. But he deals with the three great philosophers. And this is what he says. Plato thought nature but a spume that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things. Solider Aristotle played the tawse upon the bottom of a king of kings. World-famous golden-thighed Pythagoras fingered upon a fiddlestick or strings what a star sang and careless muses heard. Old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. All right, let's first figure out what these words mean, okay? Plato was the one that said that our natural world was a shadow or a copy or an imitation of the forms, right? That the real things were up in the heavens, what he called the forms, and our world was a shadow or copy of that world. But then Aristotle was solider because Aristotle sort of brought philosophy back to earth. Let's focus on this earth and not on the forms, right? And it says he played the tawse upon the bottom of the king of kings. As many of you know, Aristotle famously was the tutor of Alexander the Great, who would become the king of kings and conquer the world. Then Pythagoras, who I said really lived before Plato, he's the one who was a great cult leader. He's the one that talked about the reincarnation of the soul. And he is the one that wrote about the music of the spheres. Because Pythagoras was not only a great mathematician and philosopher and cult leader, he was also a musician. He invented the full Western scale. And in his music, he tried to sometimes mimic the rhythms of the music of the spheres. That's the music that the universe plays as the spheres rotate super fast in their perfect concentric circles through the heavens. Now, for a moment, you might think, oh, wow, he is holding up philosophy as this great thing. But look at his diction. Plato thought nature a spume, or played the tawse, or fingered upon a fiddlestick. This is all diction that sort of deflates the philosophical pretensions of Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras, turns even philosophy into just a bunch of so many images. And by saying that Aristotle played the tawse upon a king of kings, that suggests that even philosophy ends up turning into raw military and political power, right? So it's a little bit of a darker vision of philosophy. And at the end, he dismisses all of it by saying, old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. In other words, all this philosophy is just a bunch of scarecrows. But didn't we just, in a few stanzas earlier, didn't Yeats compare himself to a comfortable old kind of scarecrow? So he has got himself tied up. Maybe he's just as unnecessary as these philosophers. Maybe he's only playing with images that don't lead to anything, or at worst, lead to world conquest. So again, he's struggling with it. He's dismissing the philosophers, but maybe he's dismissing himself as well. What can the poet Yeats do? And then he starts bringing the images together. He says, both nuns, and remember, he's speaking with a nun, both nuns and mothers worship images. All right, the mother worships the image of her child and what that child will become. And what would she do if she suddenly saw the child as a 60-year-old bald guy, right, with a white beard, right? What would she do? So mothers, the image that haunts the mother that she worships is the image of her infant child and what he will become in all her dreams. The nun worship images. We're thinking of the Catholic nun, the statues, right? The statues of the Virgin Mary or Jesus. Maybe there's a mixture. Of course, mother and child are the most important images of Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. And what he's saying is both the nuns and the mothers worship images, right? Things that are apart from them, that maybe they ultimately have no control upon, but they're so fixated on either the image of the baby Jesus or the Virgin Mary or the mother's image of her child. Now watch this. Both nuns and mothers worship images, but those the candles light are not as those that animate a mother's reveries, but keep a marble or a bronze repose. So the images that the nuns worship are seen through candlelight, and they're statues, right? They should seem like they couldn't hurt you. They're not like the flesh and child baby that the mother looks at. The nun, who, is not going to be a mother because she's given herself totally to the church and to God, right? The image she looks at, marble or bronze. So we're thinking of either a marble statue or a bronze statue. And you would think that that would be less painful than the image the mother worships. But then he says at line 5, and yet they too break hearts. All images, in a way, ultimately betray us, leave us empty, including the image of heaven that the child loses when he drinks of honey of generation and it's beaten out of him. All images will haunt us sooner or later. And yet they too break hearts. O presences that passion, piety, or affection knows, and that all heavenly glory symbolize. O self-born mockers of man's enterprise. Images mock and tease us and stay just out of reach, the image we can't have. Now, he says, O presences that passion, piety, or affection knows. What's Yeats doing? He's listing 3 things: passion, piety, or affection. But in this stanza, he's only listed 2, nuns and mothers. Well, the word piety obviously refers to the nun who piously worships the images that also break her heart. And the word affection obviously refers to the mother who has that affection, that storge is the Greek word affection for the child. Why are there 3? What's passion? We've just linked the poem together, because passion is the images of Maud Gonne that are still haunting the poet. He wasn't unfaithful to his wife or anything like that. This wasn't an emotional affair like we say today. We're dealing with something much deeper here. The poet is still haunted by that Lydian body, by Maud Gonne, by when she shared that terrible thing that happened to her with him, and it linked them together. So just like the nun and just like the mother, the poet too is haunted by images. And so whether those presences evoke passion, piety, or affection, they still mock us. They tell us and remind us of what we cannot have. Now, if the poem ended here, there would be no resolution. Like I said, in the wonderful poem, The Wild Swans of Cool, which you should read, it's beautiful, there is no resolution for the poet. He can't find it for himself. He's given up. But by now, he's married, he's dealing, and he's able, in this poem, in the last stanza, to come up with a beautiful resolution. And he says, labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure's soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? In this final glorious stanza, Yeats is going to transcend himself in his poem to get a glimpse of an image that stands outside the decay of this world and its lost hope and its lost dreams and those self-born mockers that break our hearts. He's going to try to find a world where labor is blossoming or dancing. Now, of course, labor is work, but it's also the giving birth of a child. And, you know, a poem, for a poet like Yeats, a poem is the giving birth of a child. All of this struggle he's going through with these images that have haunted him so much. But here, labor is blossoming or dancing. It's an image of movement, right? That can't settle down, that continues to move and live in the world of beauty. And in this world, the body is not bruised to pleasure soul. So here would be a mystic that can achieve mystical connection without asceticism, right? Without beating the body. This is terrible. Why does it seem like the only way to release the soul is to beat the body into... No, this is a place where we can have mystical vision without asceticism, nor beauty born out of its own despair. Why is it so often that the greatest beauty comes out of the greatest sorrow? As Shelley says in his To a Skylark, we human beings, we look before and after and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thoughts. Why is it that we can't seem to just have perfect beauty? There's always pain. You ladies that are listening, there's often the joke about how ladies' beauty is born out of pain with the makeup and all the stuff and what you have to do to your hair and things like that. That's an old thing of, no, there's no pain. There's no beauty without pain, especially the old days when ladies wore corsets and things like that. Men, we don't worry about that. We're not going to go through pain for beauty. Forget that. Right? But nor beauty born out of its own despair, that we can have beauty without pain and loss, or nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil, right? In the old days, before they had good electricity, a lot of people, if they wanted to study, they had to literally burn the midnight oil, as we still say, putting a lot of strain on their eyes. Milton went blind from eye strain. Always scares me. I always have a lot of light when I'm working at night, right? But here, in other words, why is it that in our world, we cannot gain beauty without pain? We cannot gain wisdom without getting hunchbacked, hunched over, blear-eyed, looking at the book as we read by the midnight oil. Why can't there be a world, and that's what he glimpses at the end of his poem, where again, we can have mystic insight without asceticism. We can have beauty without the pain that comes with it. We can have intellectual growth without ruining our eyes from reading by candlelight and oil light. Understand? I think maybe he has in mind a great poem by Matthew Arnold called Stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse. That's Arnold's crisis poem. And he feels like he's stranded and can't move forward. But then near the end of the poem, he has a glimpse of something and he says, "Years hence, perhaps, may dawn an age more fortunate, alas, than we, that without hardness will be sage and gay without frivolity." Wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find a world and a civilization where people can be wise without being hard and cynical, or they can be gay, happy without being decadent and frivolous? In a sense, that's what Yeats is glimpsing. A world that rises above, a world where all of the things can be held together, like that moment with Maud Gonne, but a moment that's held. In the wonderful poetry of Keats, Keats often imagines heaven as something I would call process in stasis. And that must be what heaven is, right? Because heaven must be perfection. And therefore, it's got to be static if it's perfect. But how could it be heaven if it's static? There must be process and growth. So what Keats always wanted in his poems is a world of process in stasis, a world where things are frozen because they're perfect, but they're yet growing and developing and again, maturing. That must be what it is, right? And that's what he seeks in the Nightingale. The Nightingale lives in that world where tender is the night. always, everything is now in heaven. That's what he sees on the urn, in the Grecian urn, where everything is frozen, but everything is growing and moving and alive, right? In a poem he wrote called Bright Star, would I were steadfast as thou art. What he wants to be is steadfast, but not frozen. He wants to be alive and growing while also being in stasis. It's hard to find that in this world. The closest we get to it is that frozen moment when we feel like we've lived our whole life in one moment of beauty. And that's what Yeats tries to capture. Look again at those last 4 lines now. O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? Right? This is a wonderful poem called Soliloquy from Carousel by Rogers and Hammerstein, where the man has an image of his boy that's going to be born. And he says, like a tree he'll grow with his head held high and his feet planted firm in the ground. Isn't that what we want for our children? That they would be centered and tied down, but reaching for the stars. If you've ever seen the great movie Lost Horizon by Frank Capra about Shangri-La, where the people in Shangri-La are founded in the good earth of the valley while their heads meditate and seek out the unknown and the metaphysical and all that. So here is the tree that is rooted and yet growing. And he asked the question, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? The idea there is that the life of the tree inheres in all of them. In the root, in the tree, in the branches reaching up. It's all things at once. It lives now, where the image is real and you are in the image now. O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Wow. You know, this is almost touching on modern quantum physics, right? This Heisenberg uncertainty principle where you're unable to know the location of a electron and its velocity at the same time, right? You can't know its position and its velocity because you can't be both. It's like the light, which is a wave and a particle. Well, which is it? Is it just a thing, a particle, or is it something in motion? And we can't know the two. Why can't, even C.S. Lewis talked about that. Why can't we study something and enjoy it at the same time? It seems impossible. And yet, in this wonderful world that Yeats creates at the end of his poem, it's a world where images are real, where it is process and stasis at the same time. The dance is in its frozen perfection, and yet it's also dynamic and moving at the same time. And that's what Yeats is seeking as a resolution to his crisis, to all these images, and seeking after a poetic world. In a wonderful poem he wrote called Samlington Byzantium, he calls on the images in these beautiful mosaics in Ravenna, Italy, to take him to themselves and take him into the artifice of eternity. What a wonderful phrase, the artifice of eternity. And one thing I always struggle with my students, when you write plot summary in your essay, write in present tense. You don't use past tense when you're talking about a poem because art exists in a perpetual present. That's why whenever you write about a work of art, whether it's a poem or a movie or a work of art, a painting or a symphony by Beethoven, you always write about it in the present tense because it's happening now in the artifice of eternity, in the world of process in stasis, in the world that Yeats yearns for and achieves, at least poetically, in the end of his ode. So rather than be haunted by the images, learn to live in the images, to live in the now.